Hey, Jisan, how are you doing?
Hey, Janji. I'm doing good. I'm doing well. How's everything with you?
Yeah, it's all good. Beautiful sunny day today.
Awesome.
So spring is definitely here. So
That's wonderful.
all
Yeah,
good.
and I'm excited because we're going to be continuing another conversation kind of in the same space of what we covered off in the last episode, which was all around dealing with managers and dealing with different styles. And today's episode on the Own It or Quit It podcast is the truth behind the 80/20 rule and what does it mean to deal with micromanagement. So, a little bit of a meaty topic there. I know
Yeah,
there's quite a bit of clients that I deal with that have issues with micromanagement that are always trying to figure out how to manage it. And I think we can probably shed some light here. What do you think?
fantastic. Let's crack on.
Yeah, so I think the first one is, when I think about micromanagement, there was a saying that you had shared with me a long time ago, and it's something that's always stuck with me, but I thought maybe it would be fun to introduce it, as an icebreaker today. So you once said, "Eagles don't work for turkeys." Can you explain what you mean by eagles don't work for turkeys?
Well, I'm glad that you're bringing this back and that you remember. But, this is often something I discuss with leaders when we talk about building a team for them. And of course, everyone wants to work with top talent, right? So they want the best of the best, they want high potentials. And often they forget that that comes with a lot of work and a lot of responsibility. Because high potential talents, A, are attracted by high potential leaders.
Mhm.
B, they want to work for high talent and high potential leaders as well. And there are numerous reasons why it's the pace, it's the hunger to learn, and also the ability to keep moving on. And if you have a leader whose head is always down, it's difficult to find an eye contact with a talent whose head is always high up. So it's no judgment here. It's just that the fact that if leader and talent are flying on different altitude, it's going to create problem for both of them.
Yeah.
So, the message, the moral of the story, and I guess we were talking about when we were doing your induction as a senior leader, although I never had to doubt your eagleship in in the role, but that remember that hiring talents in your team comes with a lot of responsibility to fly on that altitude yourself as well.
Yeah, I always found it to be an interesting analogy, right? Because one, it sticks with me because eagles don't work for turkeys, but I think it also just amplifies the importance of the manager's role when dealing with really high talent, right? It's a
Yeah.
privilege to work with people that are extremely capable, top talent, but there's also a level of responsibility and almost managers have to be even better at what they do when dealing with that type of talent. So yeah, I always thought that
Yeah.
was an interesting one. So thanks for sharing that with us.
And maybe just one more thing, that better at what they do or really on top of their leadership and live up to that responsibility that sometimes talents working for them may take over them. And really good leadership is when you see that potential that somebody could outgrow you, you're not holding them back, you create space for them to do that. And your pride is actually if your talents are outgrowing you. And
That's right.
that's a big thing. That's an eagle sort of leadership in this
Yeah.
analogy.
Fantastic.
All right. So, um, tell me a little bit about this 80/20 thing. So, when we were talking about this episode and we've found the angle around micromanagement, there was something coming up straight away that, both of us heard numerous times in our corporate world, that, we need to go at pace and we need to learn how 80% is good enough because the rest of the 20% is just taking away all the time. And,
Yeah.
but it's not bringing so much additional value. So tell me what you think about this.
Yeah, 80/20 rule is always something that sounds really good on paper. And I've heard it so many times in different kind of forums where we're not trying to get to perfection. We're really trying to get to really strong work, and then we move on so that it frees up time. It helps people not have to get burdened by perfectionism, right? So this whole concept of 80% is good enough, and then let's move on. I think it sounds good on paper, but the reality is that the perception of what 80% is can be very different between an employee and a manager. And even when you think about multiple managers lined up, if you ask them all, what does quality look like and what does 80% look like, there may be varying definitions of it, right? So I think one of the tough parts about really implementing 80/20 is that it's so subjective. And I think for a lot of managers, they may say, I'm looking for the 80/20 here, but employees may not understand what their perception of 80% is. And there may
Mm,
be a difference between when employees feel like they got to 80% and what managers expect 80% to look like. I know that
yeah,
I've had that in my previous careers. I've worked in consulting where everything we're preparing is client facing. So therefore, there's a higher level of scrutiny in terms of the professionalism, how strong the data is, how tight the and analysis and assumptions are. So in those environments, the partners, the directors, the people that are really leading these client engagements, they look to the analysts, the consultants, and their 80% is a little bit higher than 80% of what,
mm,
I would believe, right? So, and I've done it as well with my teams at times where there's a really big meeting. And yes, we are, living in the 80/20, but I have a little bit of a higher expectation because the audience is a more senior audience, right? So
yeah.
I think 80/20 it's tough for employees and managers because of the subjectivity of it. So I think it sometimes still leads to micromanagement, even though it's intended to be a positive thing.
Yeah. And that leads me to my next question, which is, we've both lived through times when not 80%, but 100 wasn't enough. In fact, 150 was expected. So, should we call that as a micromanagement situation? And what's your view? When is that 150% appropriate?
Yeah, and I think this is why I like our podcast so much, right? Is because when we're diving into a topic, we're trying to give both sides of the story here. So we're not trying to defend micromanagement by any means, but I think the reality is the first thing is that there are times where the business does require a manager to micromanage. And I think there are times where an employee should hope that a manager micromanages because the situation requires it, because there's a business challenge we're dealing with. So there have been, business demands and situations that I've lived through. For example, a perfect one is, my team and I, this was a few years ago, we had been working about 3, 4 years on a very big launch, a brand launch in the US. And the brand launch was always expected to happen in May of 2020. Now, if you remember what that year represented, that was the big old COVID year, right? So when you think about being able to launch into that, it changed a lot of the expectations, but then also the plans and everything that we had put forward. A lot of that had to change overnight because
Yeah.
COVID was forcing us to change how consumers would interact at stores, how brands would actually interact with consumers. All of the rules changed overnight, and therefore there was a level of scrutiny that had to happen on everything we were doing. I think in those kind of circumstances, and you would want a micromanagement situation. Now, the way micromanagement should work is that it should be for a limited amount of time. And
Yeah.
I think that's the really important thing for managers to keep in mind is that if they're going to start going into a space of micromanagement, and it could be before a very big meeting, it could potentially be because the quarter didn't deliver for a financial reason. And now we have a lot more scrutiny in terms of being able to deliver plans, or there's a big question that's being asked by senior leader. Whatever the situation is, the manager needs to set an expectation that for the next 2 weeks or for the next 1 month, we are going to focus on a little bit more micromanagement because the business situation requires us to get to this level of granularity. I think by starting with setting the expectation, it allows the employee to say, okay, things are going to feel different. I am going to be scrutinized a little bit more because they are looking for answers. But I think what's critical is that during this time, there's also a level of the manager rolling up their sleeves and working alongside the team, right? So where micromanagement works well is when the manager says, okay, we're really going to dig into this, but I'm also going to be part of the team. I'm not going to float above the team and just look after all the work and require a bunch of meetings in between, but I'm actually here to help brainstorm. I'm here to think through the problem with you. So it should feel like support more than it feels like someone dominating over you, right? And I think that's the nuance there where micromanagement feels like it's a positive. I think the watch out here is if you don't get into the details and the manager is not willing to roll up their sleeves, then it becomes very hard and it becomes
Yeah,
very demoralizing, demotivating. Employees might just get to the point where they say, "You just tell me what this needs to look like, and I'll just do what you say," right? And
yeah,
I've heard teams get to that point with me. There's been circumstances where it's been high stress, and I keep asking kind of coaching questions. What about this? Would we consider this? And I can see employees saying, "Well, why don't you just tell me what it needs to be so that we can just move on with our
yeah.
lives?" And that's okay, right? But I think as a manager, you need to be able to read the room, understand how your employees are feeling and how they're dealing with the circumstance. But there are times where micromanagement is needed. I don't know, anything to add from your perspective in terms of when it's a positive or it's a necessity?
Yeah, I really liked what you said that it needs to be flagged, signposted, that it's done intentionally because it takes a lot of frustration out of the system. So, one thing is that psychologically we are wired for freedom. And even when we are willingly take on a job, which comes with a job description, which comes with boundaries, we sign off all the kind of guidelines, and we agree that we're gonna walk within those on that path. Human beings are still motivated by freedom, and yes, there are moments when an organization and every one of it needs to, everyone in it needs to operate like a military operation, and we need to be perfect execution because the risks are too high and there is no time and no room for figuring out our own way. But if it kind of goes too long, then that bites into that human need for freedom. And I think you're totally right about the moral impact, the disengagement. So the damage that can cause potentially on the workforce could be either people, your top talent, your eagles will start, leaving, or it can be that people completely give up on thinking by themselves. And, you're gonna just have a bunch of people who will, you know, sit back and wait for you to tell them how to put one foot in front of the other. And that is not the best way of using
Yeah.
talent in an organization.
Yeah, it's almost like you want to make sure that you understand that you can only go as a manager, you can only go to this flexible, I'm going to micromanage maybe only a couple of times a year, right? It's not something that you should be jumping into and trying to do every month with your team because it is very taxing from an energy perspective to micromanage on both sides. For the manager
Yeah,
as well, to have to be on top like that and asking so many questions takes a lot of effort. So
yeah,
if you're going to do it, let the business dictate when it's the right time to do it and be very clear with your team that it's a finite time that this is going to be in place. And then it can be, productive for the business, but you have to be choiceful on when to use it. So I guess, that leads us to the second part of this conversation, right? Because I'm sure there's people in our audience that are listening to this and they're saying, well, what about those managers where it's their only style and every day is micromanagement and that's the only way they know how to operate? I think that's a very different conversation than what we just had, which is times when micromanagement is needed. Talk to us about how to deal with micromanagers when that is their manager's only style and that's the only thing they flex.
yeah. Well, indeed, this is when micromanagement becomes problematic, when a leader uses it habitually and not situationally. And, people reporting to a leader like that will figure this out very quickly. People gonna recognize the pattern, and soon they will need to decide what's next. They're gonna just let that happen, or they're gonna rebel against it, or they're gonna quit. So, podcast name is Own It or Quit It, is actually the advice that we want to give our audience that if you feel like you're being for a long, long time micromanaged and you haven't been given a reason why, and you feel that this is a kind of leadership style that it makes it difficult for you to give your best, then own it. Then own the conversation, show up, and talk to your line manager and have a transparent conversation about what is not working for you in this situation. Of course, this is a risky one because that is giving feedback to your boss, which, not every culture is accepting that. And I would strongly advise to prepare for it and test your thoughts and adjust it to your local culture, but find your way to address it. And the most transparent way of, if you have your regular catch up, bring this up and tell your line manager that you notice, and what is the impact on you. There is a simple way of non aggressive communication, but you're holding your line, which is tell your facts, tell your feelings, how it makes you feel, and make a very clear request. And if you stick to this, then that's an impactful way of telling your truth.
So, Jonesy,
Yeah.
I guess a question there. So, what happens if the individual approaches their manager, says, "Hey, you're micromanaging me. I don't like this," or, and says it in a polite way, but hears that, well, it's because you're a low performer, or it's because I believe you have these gaps and that's why I'm forcing you. So now we're in this situation where I asked the question and now I'm hearing some feedback that's quite, tough to hear, right? Now,
Yeah.
what happens in that kind of situation?
So that's the other side of going transparent about it, that you may say something that the other party doesn't want to hear, or you may invite feedback that you don't want to hear. So, this is where the style of communication is absolutely essential. And if we kind of zoom out of this, that this is not a personal battle. The reason why we are opening this conversation to create a work environment that is best for everybody and that we can perform with ease and with joy, and we can enjoy our work as well. And but at the same time, we are crystal clear of what expected from us. That's the goal, right? And if you see this is the goal, then perhaps it's easier to open your ears for feedback. Now, if you're being told that you've been micromanaged over time because you're a poor performer, and that's the first time you're hearing it, I have a problem with that because, that can happen that, each of us, that we don't do what is expected from us, either because we are incapable or because we don't know, or, it can happen. That's all right. But, leaders are expected to tell you that transparently before
Yeah.
they start introducing extreme measures. And constant micromanagement is an extreme measure. So if you are on a performance improvement process, then it is expected that you're going to have a weekly check-in meetings with your boss when they're going to check what you're doing, because the purpose of that is to figure out where your blocks are, or figure out whether the situation can be fixed or we need to find another solution. But if you find yourself being checked on a weekly basis without that transparent feedback session, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That then I would strongly encourage you to open the conversation and let's put the cards on the table. We are adults.
Yeah, I think if I was in that situation and I heard for the first time that, well, you're being micromanaged because, you have this gap or you have this, development need, what I would probably ask for then is, what do you need to see differently to stop micromanaging me, right? And not in such a aggressive, combative way, but more around this idea of, okay, so what is the demonstrated performance that you would like to see from me that would then give you the confidence to essentially back off, right? And not micromanage me. And let's have that conversation, because then it gives the employee some clear guardrails in terms of well, I expect the level of analysis to be this, or I expect the quality of your, delivery of your materials or whatever it is you're creating to be at this level. And then maybe ask for examples. Can you show me what that looks like? Show me what, your level of expectation is so that I know what to strive for, right? And I think
Yeah.
using the conversation to then have really clear benchmarks in terms of what that performance is, then everyone should be clear that when you start performing that way, the micromanagement should start to take a step back,
Yeah,
right?
I really like what you're saying because essentially, you're highlighting an important point that performance management starts with objective setting, right?
Yes,
So it's very late when you start, performance manage somebody when there are no clear expectations, no
that's
clear
right.
guidelines. So when that happens and you don't understand why you're being micromanaged, you actually open the discussion about, are we absolutely clear? Are we on the same page regarding the
Hmm.
expectations? So you go back there first. I think where we are on the same page is in terms of anything that you can focus the conversation on the performance, on what happened is versus the other person. So to kind of resist the temptation to make it personal and try to look at the thing together, be on the same side of the table. Because at the end of the day, everyone wants good performance from everybody, and we want to live in peace, and at least most of us, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think until you have a reason to anticipate differently, best to anticipate that there is a misalignment somewhere in the system and starting it with realigning on the objectives. It's probably the best, wisest advice.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the other side of our podcast, name is own it or quit it, right? So I think what we're describing here is a conversation where you're trying to own it. I think the reality is that if you are in a situation where your manager just continues to only have that one style, that may be a limitation of the manager, right? In
Yeah,
which case, you need to have the ability to be able to deal with it for a set period of time and then look for that next role, look for a rotation, look for the opportunity to move into a role that's a better fit for you. And, it's always easier said than done, right? But I think that's also a reality of it is that you have these conversations, you contract what those performance benchmarks are. If you still feel like things are not improving, I think it's also a signal that no one needs to be micromanaged, right? And nobody's career is worth going through that stress if it is really something that keeps you up and makes it difficult to come into work. Like that's a really hard situation to be in.
absolutely. Because at the end of the day, eagles don't work for turkeys, right?
There you go. I love that. And you can't close on anything better than that, right? So since you mentioned that, let's talk about the homework for this week, right? So, one of the things that we talked about was, one thing that I would suggest is have a really clear definition with your manager on 80/20. So at the very beginning of this, episode, we talked about there's a lot of subjectivity when you start to describe the 80/20 rule. So one thing that I would say is, if you have a situation with your manager that there is a difference of opinions, be very clear on, can you help me understand what 80 looks like for you? That way, as an individual, I know what to strive for and when I've reached 80, right? So I think that's definitely one. What about yourself? Is there any homework that you would recommend?
Yeah, I would recommend to do a bit of soul searching and look in the mirror and reflect on, have I done anything? Is there anywhere where I kind of feel I'm missing the mark? As you know, leadership starts with itself, and we are, if you consider yourself as a leader, the best place to start any change is with yourself. So yeah, the good old self-awareness and self-reflection would do a good
Yeah.
job here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think this was a great conversation as always. What I would always tell everyone is micromanagement is tough. Assume positive intent. Assume that the individual is micromanaging you because they believe the business warrants it, or maybe because they're trying to help your development. I think the most important thing is that you have the conversations and you have a bit of the straight talk in terms of understanding why it's happening, understanding what they're looking for, and then having that clarity should hopefully help, right? So yeah, so
Absolutely.
thanks for your time, John D.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you. Take care. Bye
Bye bye.
then.